Hello, and welcome to our first of two Winter 2022 Brown Bag Lectures presented by the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College, in collaboration with the University of Manitoba's Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities and in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Please take the time to acknowledge the traditional territories of the lands where you are sitting today. My name is Charlotte Enns, and I am the director of the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice here at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. And the Morrow Institute was founded as the Morrow Center some 20 years ago through the vision and support of Dr. Arthur Morrow and under the direction of founding directors, Dr. Sean Byrne and Dr. Jessica Senehi. Throughout the pandemic, the Morrow Institute has continued to shine the spotlight on the alumni of the University of Manitoba's PhD program in Peace and Conflict Studies. And we are especially pleased to be able to have featured all three co-editors of research from the Morrow Institute book series, including Dr. Katarina Standish and Laura Reimer last fall, and today, Dr. Chuck Thiessen. So the first two volumes of the book series, Conflict Transformation, Peacebuilding, and Storytelling, which was published in September 2018, and Expanding the Edges of Narrative Inquiry, published in November 2019, are published by Lexington Books and available from Rowan and Littlefield. Links to both books can be found on the Morrow Institute website and on the page for the Brown Bag Lectures series. Please note that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available on the Morrow Institute's YouTube channel in the coming days. A link to the lecture will also be added to the Morrow Institute's Brown Bag Lecture webpage. The format of today's lecture will include post-lecture question and answer session. To facilitate this, we ask you to type your question in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box during the lecture, and we will entertain those questions during the Q&A portion of the lecture. The lecture, including the Q&A, will be 1 hour in length. We may also invite you into the discussion and to voice your question in person if you wish, as the time and flow of the discussion permits. All right, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Chuck Thiessen to the Brown Bag Lecture table today. Hello, Chuck. Welcome here. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure.
So just as a little bit of background, can you remind me and our audience, what was the focus of your research when you were here and in the PAX program?
For sure. Yes, I studied in the PAX program at the PhD level from 2008 to 2012. And yeah, the focus of my research for my thesis was on the country of Afghanistan, and in particular, the international peace-building intervention that was occurring in full flight at that point. And especially looking at the sort of messy relationship between international organizations and local counterparts, thinking a lot about local ownership.
Great. Okay, so then what have you been doing since then? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. It has been my philosophy to try at least, as many things as I can in life. And yeah, so after my PhD, I did a short stint working in Afghanistan as a research manager for a peace building NGO. And then after that, in early 2013, I started work as a professor at Coventry University in the UK. And I worked in the Center for Peace and Reconciliation Studies, which eventually morphed into the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. And I worked there until this past summer. In August 2021, I left. And over my period there, of work there, it was a research heavy position, and I did a lot of research in several places, Afghanistan, and the context that I'll be talking about today. Kyrgyzstan, I work there a lot, but also Israel, Palestine, Somalia, and Turkey, and some other places. Yeah, so
lots of different perspectives that you're bringing into your talk today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No problem. Yeah, but like many academics, haven't found the pandemic to be a little bit unsettling. And yes, the pandemic sort of inspired me to try something different than academia. So yeah, what had happened was, while I was working for the university in the UK, I had actually relocated with my family and I back to Canada, to Ottawa, and I was working at a distance. But with the pandemic, that became not very manageable, and so I left permanently and went into the human rights research here in Canada. Have been working in that for a while, and then now I'm moving into research with the government. So yeah, it's a bit of a quickly morphing situation.
Wow. Well, we look forward to hearing more about all these experiences and how they've shaped some of your perspectives on the issues. So with no further ado, I'll hand the floor over to you. We look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right, so I will share my screen. All right, Charlotte, if that does not seem okay, just let me know, but I'll assume that's coming through.
Looks good to me. I hope it looks good to everyone else.
All right, good. Yeah, so the title of my lecture today is Preventing Violent Extremism While Protecting Human Rights. And this was a research project that I finished a couple of years ago, and it was funded by the British Academy in the UK. So yeah, violence committed by individuals and groups labeled as extremist have occurred in most countries over the last decade, and violent extremism is now widely regarded as a significant threat to global peace and development. And extremism, quote unquote extremism, is now regularly called upon as a justification for intervention. We're very aware of that now. Just a couple of weeks ago, the government of Canada, as part of its justification for the Emergencies Act in February, they were pointing to extremism. The justification given by Putin for the invasion of Ukraine involved pointing out extremism. And beyond that, of course, there are dozens and dozens of international military and non-military intervention activities in the Middle East, across the Sahel region of Africa. These are only a few examples of the regular use of extremism to justify intervention. Sorry, why is my slide not going forward? Sorry, one moment, my slide is not advancing. Not sure why. Yeah, so in response to the problem of extremism, and in particular violent extremism, the international community, including the UN as a normative and operational leader in this area, has mounted a significant response. One part of it being certainly counter-terrorism activities, but then of more interest here is what the UN considers to be a subset of counter-terrorism, which is preventing violent extremism. And the UN uses the language of preventing violent extremism, PVE, but you will often also see CVE being used, or which stands for countering violent extremism. CVE is more common in the US. And so as part of this interventionist movement, the UN Secretary General in 2016 commissioned a major document of, that is regularly referenced throughout the UN system and even amongst other international organizations, and that is the 2016 Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism. And this document recognizes the scale of the global threat and lays the groundwork for PVE throughout the UN system. And this plan of action fits under the UN's overarching counterterrorism strategy, as I just mentioned. And so this sort of shift within the UN system is a significant shift in the last 5 years in particular. The UN has conducted PVE projects in at least 47 countries. The last time I counted was in 2017. It might be less or more now, I'm not sure. And as another example, the EU is conducting PVE interventions in about 40 countries when I counted in 2018. And so this presentation will inspect the UN's plan of action and how it is playing out in one country in particular, Kyrgyzstan. And so as I mentioned, I will be focusing on the issue of whether human rights are being respected inside of those projects. I'm not sure why it is not advancing on the slide, so I'm just going to change the view slightly here, Charlotte, and that way I won't have to spend so much time.
Yeah, I'm no help to you here, so
yeah,
whatever you think you can figure out is probably fine.
I'm just going to just try and enlarge that screen a bit. All right. So is that okay, Charlotte? Is it
yes,
sort
that's
of,
good. Yeah, we can see the main slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll leave it at that then.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me give you a little bit of context here, in case you're not familiar with the country of Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan, it's a bit of a tiny country sitting in Central Asia, a population of sort of around 6 million people. And it sits northwest of China, south of Kazakhstan, and is sort of intertwined with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan in these bizarre sort of post-colonial borders that are that sort of run through the mountains of the region. But it really is an amazing country to visit if it ever is a possibility. Just a couple. The country. It is very beautiful and very hospitable people. It is home to the World Nomad Games. The picture on the right there, the pinnacle of sport at the games is a game called Kokbaru, which is a form of horseback polo, or sort of keep away using a dead goat carcass. There's also excellent hiking and skiing and mountain climbing and so forth in the country, and it's way cheaper than going to Switzerland or British Columbia or as far as ski passes, let's say. That being said, the country has also experienced a lot of turmoil and violence, and I will just quickly survey a couple incidents. Yeah, so the social and political transition of Kyrgyzstan after the breakup of the Soviet Union is signposted by two major civil uprisings. Well, actually now three as of 2020, but I'll just focus on the first two. The first one was the 2005 Tulip Revolution. This was a largely non-violent protest movement that removed the country's first president. And then in 2010, a much more violent rebellion deposed his successor, Kurmanbek Bakiev. And following Bakiev's removal, the Kyrgyz transitional government really struggled to stabilize Kyrgyz society and politics. And inter-ethnic clashes, predominantly between Kyrgyz and Uzbek citizens in southern Kyrgyzstan broke out, which killed hundreds and displaced tens of thousands. This was a very shocking experience for the people of Kyrgyzstan, so much so that when you're talking with someone from there, you do not directly reference the violence, but you instead call them the 2010 events. Yeah, it was a bit of a traumatic time. And yeah, so as I showed you on the map earlier, the southern part of Kyrgyzstan borders Uzbekistan and is home to a significant Uzbek population, Kyrgyzstan's largest ethnic minority. Stimulating these clashes were a bunch of things: perceived ineffective governance, social and economic inequality, political exclusion, competitions for power by local leaders in the southern regions and countries. Deep ethnic and regional divisions have lingered after these events, and southern society is still characterized by mistrust for local and central governments, including for the justice system and law enforcement and social segregation. So in response, yeah, the international community threw a lot of funding and programming at the situation, and so the UN system, through its peacebuilding fund, implemented a suite of projects during 2010 to 2018 that worked to prevent a relapse into violent conflict by, the projects that work to reform the police, the justice system, national and local governance structures, reconstruct citizens' trust, as well as support local dispute resolution and working with youth, civil society, religious leaders, the media, and so forth. And during this period, I worked for a couple of years there with the UN, organizing the baseline and endline studies of those projects. However, during that period, as those PBF projects were being implemented, there were three social trends that became much more visible and important. And so the first was that the years after 2010 were not really healing the Uzbek populations. And so Uzbeks, even after all these projects and so forth, continue to feel very disenfranchised and believe that the national government has unfairly sided with their Kyrgyz counterparts. Second, during this time period, several groups with ideologies labeled as extremist escalated their activity significantly in Kyrgyzstan, and with some of them actively recruiting foreign fighters to travel to Syria and Iraq and carry out attacks and fight there. And then thirdly, the Kyrgyz government, also expressed a lot of alarm at what was happening. So for example, authorities counted about 803 citizens of Kyrgyzstan that traveled as foreign fighters to Syria, and from a country with a smaller population, it's fairly significant. And during this period, many of those fighters and their families were also returning, which was creating a lot of difficult situations in local communities. And then the other thing that you will have seen on the news over the years is that several prominent attacks that have been called terrorist attacks in a bunch of countries, including Kyrgyzstan, the US, Turkey, Sweden, and Russia, have been committed by citizens of Kyrgyzstan or by individuals who have spent a significant time in Kyrgyzstan. And in many of the cases, the perpetrators were shown to be from the minority Uzbek population. And then, a last dynamic is that both Uzbek and Kyrgyz populations are becoming more deeply religious, and this I'm really concerned, this sort of secular mentality of the post-Soviet elites in Kyrgyzstan, who were having a difficult time understanding why women were again, wearing much more conservative clothing, and the number of religious teachers coming into the country from places like Saudi Arabia and so forth. And so in response, the UN system decided to extend its projects, but to adopt a bit of a different framework, and more of a framework of prevention, and in particular preventing violent extremism as its sort of strategic peacebuilding approach. And that pivot coincided with many countries around the world, kind of around 2015 to 2020 in there approximately. So in Kyrgyzstan, the UN's approach to PVE looked like this. So they ran projects working with young people, young decision makers to resist radicalization. They worked on reducing social disparities and increasing inclusion in communities vulnerable to extremist influence. They worked at building community resilience to violent ideologies through the education system and civic dialogues. They worked in prisons, the probation system, the police, forensic services to prevent radicalization inside prisons, manage violent extremist offenders, and ensure fair trials. They worked at building the capacities of state justice and security institutions at multiple levels to better apply the rule of law and establish human rights compliant mechanisms. And they also did a lot of projects that work to empower women and girls and bolster their capacity to resist radicalization and violent extremism. So now I'll turn to the research project that I implemented in a bit more detail. So first, some of the methods. So this presentation is based upon 47 interviews that I conducted between 2017 and 2018. And the respondents were staff at UN headquarters in New York, UN staff and from national and regional offices within Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz governmental officials, and several civil society implementing organizations in Kyrgyzstan. And except for the interviews in New York, where I compared Kyrgyzstan to other countries, the ones in Kyrgyzstan got into the projects in detail in Kyrgyzstan. And then if there's any grad students on the call today, I would recommend you do a little bit of research, find out about learning history workshops. I have found them a very effective way to gather data, especially if you are doing research inside of institutions. So basically a learning history workshop, it gathers, in this case, UN project officials together inside a room in which we process through the history and trajectory of their, in this case, PVE projects. And so, the overall goal here being, to have the participants reflecting upon their personal and also institutional experiences with these sort of emerging PVE approaches. A little bit of rationale for the research. So there's a screenshot of the cover of the front page of the famous plan of action from the UN. And this plan of action, looks beyond sort of hard security-based counterterrorism measures to more systemic preventive action that can be done inside of their peacebuilding programs. And so by focusing on prevention, it mandates UN agencies and member states to adopt a comprehensive approach to engaging with the drivers of violent extremism as well as its consequences. And the plan of action's comprehensive approach involves aligning ongoing humanitarian development, peace-building, security, and political interventions with the goals of preventing violent extremism. So really what you have are these, traditional roles that the UN plays, but they sort of serve as a delivery vehicle in some ways for new approaches to delivering them, if that makes sense. And in this case, for example, peace building work is now done through a lens of preventing violent extremism, which has very distinct effects on the types of projects that it designs and implements. Yeah, but keep in mind here that UN PVE initiatives work alongside a wide variety of national and international networks and consortia, to preempt violent social movements. And the UN's leadership and programming on PVE has provoked government and non-governmental partners across the globe to align their interventions with the UN's approach, often through the promise of funding. So the UN sort of normative leadership in this case, I would say has, really changed the overall peace building approach, that the EU takes, different international governments and embassies also take in many countries. So for example, in Pakistan, I think all of the US embassies projects have to have some sort of a component of, in that case, CVE, built into the interventions. At least a couple of years ago, that was the case. To date, there has been inadequate research on how the UN and other international organizations can promote human rights as part of their PVE programming, a gap that this research hopes to address, because I think many people are very worried about that dynamic in particular. And UN PVE interventions are, it's a relatively new phenomenon and hasn't really been sort of rigorously evaluated yet. But the stakes are high. I think, the impetus for this change largely comes from sort of global headquarters of these international organizations. However, the effects of the projects are very acutely felt at the very local level, sort of at the village level, where there, where these projects can be, quite upsetting in some cases, and dismantling certain traditional power structures that that maybe have very sort of unexpected consequences to these projects in many cases. All right, so I'll go through a few of the findings. So two sort of overarching findings that I'll talk about first, and then I'll get a bit more detailed on some others. So promoting human rights through PVE initiatives is a challenge in at least two ways. So first, PVE projects often coexist with quote unquote hard counterterrorism initiatives, which have tended to prioritize the interests of national governments and the security of donor nations over the concerns of local communities and individuals. And the second one that I'll talk about is that, even quote unquote soft PVE approaches can be pernicious in that they exacerbate pre-existing social tensions and divisions, or legitimize government crackdowns and oppression that involve human rights abuses. And so UN policies and documents, do recognize the need to protect human rights, but adequate guidance on how to actually do this in very complex circumstances and especially with the governments that are either authoritarian or leaning towards the authoritarian end of the spectrum. That sort of guidance is it's pretty hard to write or and also come by. Yeah, this disconnect is made worse by the fact that PVE cannot be definitively sort of segregated from the UN's cooperation with host governments on counterterrorism. And so thus, while the UN officials or project people, probably can differentiate between their counterterrorism and PVE initiatives, local populations probably cannot really pick it apart that well. And this only degrades the UN's ability to play a peacemaking role in these conflict-affected situations. And so you get this sort of blurring of PVE and counterterrorism. And so, in a situation where, it'd be difficult to imagine how PVE cannot appear to sort of undermine human rights. And so, there is, certainly growing evidence that the UN system is, quite unprepared to engage with these dilemmas. A lot of the staff are just simply not quite prepared to really be thinking through how their projects fit together with military operations and very invasive police operations that the host state might be conducting. And so, these, host states where they're working, in this way sort of hinder the UN efforts to ensure the respect for human rights through a wide variety of issues. And, that I have listed here, things like, targeting foreign terrorist fighters, issuing vague definitions of terrorism and extremism, declaring travel bans, revoking citizenships, expanding police and intelligence powers, issuing lengthy pre-charge and pre-trial detentions, clamping down on peaceful protests and other civil society actions, limiting academic and religious freedom, declaring states of emergency, and misusing preventive detentions, control orders, special courts, and even using death penalties and executions. So this sort of degradation of human rights can, probably cancel most of the gains that PVE programming, hopes to achieve, and actually inspire greater extremism and violence. And so I have given a link there to a really excellent piece of research done by UNDP across Africa. So after the session, please take a look at that if you have a time to do that. So please jot it down. But this piece of research really evidenced how human rights grievances and poor governance across Africa are conducive to accelerated radicalization and the spread of violent extremism and terrorism. And so it really showed how, at the end of the day, in many cases, it is actually state violence, sometimes committed in the name of counterterrorism, that actually fires violent extremism and further terrorism. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so considering the research evidence that is emerging, the question needs to be asked, like, how can the UN be a supportive but also critical partner of these host states, especially if they are on the authoritarian end of the spectrum? As we know, the UN is certainly not neutral, even if that sort of language is sometimes used. States invite the UN, into, within its borders to serve, the state agenda. Thus PVE agendas are shaped by state-centric values and often, must be implemented alongside hard security counterterrorism initiatives. And so at the same time, the UN is also mandated, of course, to uphold international human rights and push member states to uphold the human rights for all of their, all of their constituents, including, including disaffected minority groups and populations affected by violence. And so these dissonant mandates of the UN certainly are challenging to navigate. A second finding, I have spent more time thinking this one through and have published these specific findings in a paper in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. And yeah, so if you remember a couple slides earlier, I gave a brief summary of the PV projects that are being implemented in Kyrgyzstan. And one of the major findings that came out of my research as the participants talked about those projects was a concern that PVE approaches to peace building are fundamentally ambiguous. And indeed, ambiguities in UN PVE interventions may be actually hindering the promotion of human rights. And so in this paper that I wrote, I build a theory of strategic ambiguity. So emphasizing that ambiguity in an intervention is very different than sort of uncertainty, let's say, that can be fixed. Or where there's even a desire to sort of fix uncertainty, but ambiguity might be actually purposeful and serve strategic purposes inside a UN intervention. So, for example, in very complex situations where there are problematic forms of governance on the part of the host state, it might be beneficial for the UN to ensure greater cooperation by giving the host state greater managerial latitude to design the intervention in ways that serve their interests also. And so that requires, in many cases, being quite ambiguous about the directives that are coming from international headquarters. Like, let's say, New York, for example, for the UN. So I will talk a bit about more about two areas of ambiguity here. The first one is ambiguity in the terminology and strategies of intervention, what I might call definitional ambiguity. And then secondly, the ambiguity in the drivers of radicalization and violent extremism. So with the first one, you can take a look at this sort of chart here that considers three sort of foundational terms that come through in UN project documents: radicalization, extremism, and violent extremism. And as you sort of survey my very brief entries there, you will see very different perceptions of those terms. Yeah, so in reality, my respondents, talked a lot about the difficulty of sort of settling on common understandings of these key terms, and in this case, definitions really do matter. They really do shape the type of an intervention that is attempted. So, for example, there was a lot of dissonance between government officials and on the one hand, and UN and civil society representatives on the other. So, for example, if we look at the term violent extremism, UN respondents were very clear that they were targeting violent extremism in their projects. Government partners, however, consistently dismissed conditioning the word extremism with the word violent. To them, that violent extremism is a tautology, right? It doesn't really make sense because in their minds, extremism is just simply assumed to be a violent experience. And it's a bit difficult to sort of pick apart some of those different conceptions, but there are very important consequences to thinking about extremism in these ways. Yeah, so for example, UN respondents, they were very careful to emphasize that they are not there to sort of judge the beliefs of the Kyrgyz people that are sort of held in confidence, as long as they don't result in sort of violent actions. The UN respondents sort of, believe that it wasn't their job to go about, changing what people believe. That's what they would say. But if you actually inspect their project documents, I think that isn't quite an honest perspective. I don't think. But to compare that to the government, government officials, they were very open about the belief in their right to intervene in people's lives if they believe that those people are believing extremist if they're holding extremist beliefs. So, for example, I heard many stories about police ramming their way suddenly into a home, finding a pamphlet sitting on a shelf that was written in Arabic, and even though they couldn't actually read the pamphlet, they made the assumption that that was an extremist teaching of some sort, and then the poor individual was then hauled off to jail. So you can see the way that you sort of think about extremism as opposed to the violent extremism really makes a difference. And and as if in that case, whether some of those conceptions were not shaped in the sort of Soviet history. And so, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I haven't really thought this through, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if, part of the dissonance between the West and Russia, and in terms of thinking about the Ukraine, is also, impacted by different ways of thinking about extremism. But that's a question for a whole nother paper that I haven't really thought through yet. And so dissonant conceptions and definitions, leave PVE projects vulnerable, I think, to human rights abuses. And PVE projects may actually squash healthy democratic governance. So for example, states, may use PVE to label dissenting domestic groups and very legitimate political resistance movements as violent extremists or as extremists, and using PVE projects to oppress such movements. And so this sort of rollback in human rights disproportionately affects groups that I think we are all very concerned about, groups like civil society activists, peaceful protesters, ethnic minorities, impoverished groups, the religiously devout, reporters and bloggers, academics, and all with a perceived support of the UN under its PVE agenda. So there are significant issues there. And then the last finding that I'll talk about today is the ambiguity in the drivers of radicalization and of violent extremism. Yeah, so UN peacebuilding practitioners and their government and non-government partners, certainly do not agree on which drivers of violent extremism are the most relevant, or how they should respond to these drivers in this case, but probably also in most countries in which they are conducting PVE interventions. And so this is a significant area of ambiguity and disagreement, given the necessity of identifying, negotiating, and agreeing on a theory of change to guide UN PVE projects. So I'll explain a bit more why I would label this as an ambiguous situation. So in Kyrgyzstan, there are at least 5, but probably many more drivers that are pointed to in terms of why is the country struggling with violent extremism. And so the first one that you will hear regularly here and also elsewhere is is that religiosity or like deepening religiosity is a reliable indicator of radicalization. And so government respondents in this case were consistently willing to connect deepening Islamic devotion to extremism. And they were concerned that political Islam will disrupt the political status quo. UN and civil society respondents, on the other hand, expressed concern that the state is conflating religious radicalization with a violent extremism and consequently, disregarding human rights in the way that the government responds. A second one, ethnic discord. So numerous UN and civil society respondents believe that unresolved tensions and with and discrimination against minority groups by the majority Kyrgyz population and the government was driving members of these minority groups towards violent ideologies. And so in Kyrgyzstan, numerous respondents referred to continued injustice following the 2010 events as motivating radicalization amongst minority populations. Government respondents carefully avoided this topic altogether. Migration. So some of the respondents believe that, the extremists were radicalized within Kyrgyzstan, but many others pointed out that perhaps it was actually occurring somewhere else. As you know, there is a steady flow of economic migrants from Kyrgyzstan into Russia, for example, where they can acquire better paying jobs. And that it is actually in Russia where these economic migrants come into contact with groups like perhaps Chechen groups and so forth, where they because these young migrants are away from their family supports, away from their community supports, and become very vulnerable to adopting violent ideologies. And then as a result, travel or traveled to the Middle East as foreign fighters. Fourth one, political and economic marginalization. So numerous UN and civil society respondents believe that political and economic grievances may motivate violent extremism. And so one important political grievance were abusive counter-terrorist actions in local communities. And again, government respondents carefully avoided this driver altogether when I was talking about it with them. Another common one is blaming poverty and inadequate education. And so many of the respondents wrestled with whether this was actually the case. There is a certain amount of research that has been done that shows that poverty and education do not have direct links towards convincing someone to be a foreign fighter in the Middle East, for example. But there was a lot of disagreement on this amongst my respondents. Now, the point here is not so much to debate the value of each of these individual drivers, but just the mere fact that my respondents referenced a wide variety of drivers, what I would call a menu of drivers. And so if you go into the project documents for UNPV projects, they will sort of pick and choose the driver or drivers that best fits the mandate of their particular agency, or the driver that perhaps works the best to achieve some interests of their partners, or or so be it. But this, the existence of a menu of drivers that are convenient to use, certainly points toward a very ambiguous situation when projects are developed. And so, in conclusion, I've tried to put together a couple recommendations. And so, by adopting an ambiguous approach to PVE, the UN leaves its interventions vulnerable to misuse and subversion, potentially contributing to human rights abuses. And so the UN can take several steps to reduce this ambiguity and clarify its terms of engagement with host states. And again, especially if they are on the authoritarian end of the spectrum, or if they have weak democratic processes. To better ensure that the promotion of human rights is there in their PVE initiatives. And so a couple of recommendations. First, the UN can certainly reduce conceptual ambiguity by analyzing the paths local constituents take to radicalization and violent extremism on an ongoing basis, as opposed to a one-off activity, which is pretty typical when projects are developed inside of countries. There will be some sort of assessment at a particular point in time. Projects are developed, but meanwhile, there's all sorts of complexities that emerge or are realized as the projects are ongoing. And so this could allow for ongoing negotiation of important PVE concepts and strategies. And an ongoing analysis would be, should be participatory and involve as wide a range of stakeholders as possible, including humanitarians, the more politically oriented UN agencies, as well as local and national governments, civil society, and especially underrepresented groups. In this case, so for example, inside of the military and the police, there is a massive underrepresentation of a variety of groups, including women, and certainly ethnic minorities. And then second, the UN can reduce ambiguity regarding the drivers of violent extremism by basing PVE initiatives on independent research that uses rigorous methods of data collection. And so this sort of research should move beyond the sort of individual level indicators to qualitatively investigate structural issues and grievances. And so in fact, it is unlikely that even focusing too much upon certain drivers of violent extremism is really that useful at all. And it might be more helpful to simply state openly and honestly that there are multiple pathways to violent extremism, all of which are complex, are saturated with different contingencies, interact with each other in very confusing ways, and so forth. And then third, the UN can make it clear that it supports government and non-government oversight groups that keep states accountable for promoting human rights. So for example, UN PVE projects should cooperate with state judicial oversight bodies to monitor law enforcement and other security actors. And this can certainly ensure that PVE activities are not hijacked by competing security agendas that exacerbate violence and neglect human rights. And so, in summary, reducing ambiguity in this way should dilute, but probably not eliminate, of course, the inherent contradiction in the UN's dual role as a critic, but also a supporter of host states with a variety of different, government types. And the UN should, seek to reduce the odds in any way possible that states instrumentalize violent extremism for political ends or use PVE initiatives to legitimize the oppression of political opponents and minority groups in particular. So that concludes my lecture. If you are interested in reading more about this, I did publish parts of the lecture today in a policy brief that is available through the International Peace Institute, headquartered in New York. And so the link is there, or you can just do a search for it online. It is pretty accessible. So I'll stop with that, and I'll take off my screen sharing, Charlotte.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chuck Thiessen, for all your insights into the complexities and of defining and protecting human rights, and the importance of reducing those ambiguities, as you mentioned. So we will open the floor to questions. I believe because we can have both questions posted in the Q&A, as well as if you want to raise your hand, we can also address questions that way, because there's a pretty familiar group of people here. So we're happy to let you voice your question.
Charlotte, we have a question from Callum Dean, and I can read it, Callum, or you can certainly bring voice to your question if you like.
Hi, Chuck. Thanks for your presentation. I had a question about sort of, I guess, relating this to other structures of counterterrorism, like more globally. So I was wondering how ambiguity in the PVE is related to supporting the sort of global war on terror and the continuing global war on terror, and how is it contributed to the normalization of counterterrorism strategies in state, foreign, and domestic policy, and actions such as like policing, for example?
Yeah, I would expect that many of the same issues in terms of ambiguity are actually, or let me put it a bit differently. I would expect that many international organizations, if they want to maintain any sense of sort of internal integrity, basically are really forced to operate in a very ambiguous state. The war on terror has unleashed all sorts of very types of like actions on the parts of states that it works with that are difficult to digest, I'm sure, inside the UN, for example. And so if they take a much more ambiguous response or sort of ambiguous approach, then it allows them to still sort of believe that they are maintaining some sense of internal integrity as they cooperate with these ventures. So for example, inside of the counterterrorism architecture within the UN, Russia and Russian diplomats have played a leading role in that architecture, as have Saudi Arabia and Egypt, for example. So you have three countries where many would point to not being very respectful of human rights. Of a lot of organizations are actually providing the lead for the UN's counterterrorism efforts, and so in that case, how can you really push forward with integrity unless you are actually quite willing to be quite ambiguous? I think that might sort of get at what you're asking.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, for sure. Or
yeah,
is
go
that
ahead.
okay?
Absolutely.
How would you apply that into the current context in Canada, where far-right extremism has met a very different sort of response than, for example, religious extremism?
Interesting. I haven't thought about that, but I would, I guess at a basic level, it certainly takes a very sort of critical approach, and I'm not quite able to sort of describe this like fully, but I think as as the Canadian government, or inside the provincial governments, for example, there is a very different response to extremists of different stripes, right? And this did come on to the news this week in the case of Denmark, where there is a very active push to be sending Syrian refugees packing, while they are very enthusiastically, taking in refugees that have been fleeing the Ukraine, right? So I think some of those some of the differences in which different people groups are responded to, I think will become much more clearer over the coming months, I would think, and it's a real cause for reflection, I think.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I would love to ask you more about the nomad games and the playing polo with a carcass of a goat, but perhaps there's one more question we can take. I know we're a little bit over the hour, but if there is anyone else who has a question, we can take that now. I don't see any in the Q&A, but did anyone want to raise their hand? Well, there's just a question here. I wonder how a government that wants to quibble about definitions and terminology feels about their responsibility to the Uzbek minority for inclusion in government, civil society, and the economy, even in the face of acknowledged extremism.
Yeah, the government of Kyrgyzstan is in a difficult position. The rates of Uzbeks joining the police, for example, are marginal, sort of hovering between 0 and 1% or something. Don't quote me on that, because it's been many years since I've looked, but yeah, there are almost no Uzbeks joining the police, but yet the police, as are other government line ministries, responsible for providing security and services inside communities that are predominantly Uzbek, especially in the south of Kyrgyzstan. And it creates a very difficult situation where all of the police on the street are Kyrgyz, and the community might have be 70, 80, 90% Uzbek. And also, if the government representatives are also primarily Kyrgyz and they're providing services in these communities, you can just sort of imagine that it's really creates a context and opens the doors for very real feelings of inequality and differential treatment and so forth. And over the course of the UN's peacebuilding projects, they were not very successful in actually changing the situation, unfortunately. So, for example, in the police service, as is the case in those types of institutions, for example, there are certain barriers that new recruits have to pass through, some being different forms of hazing, certain rituals and rites that recruits have to successfully pass in order to be sort of accepted into the body of the military or into the police forces and so forth. And that's just one small example where recruits coming from the minority groups, were in many cases, they simply couldn't sort of wrap their mind around going through that kind of experience, and would just far rather avoid joining the military or the police in that case. And I'm sure there are many other, other barriers that ethnic minorities experience or perceive in other government institutions, for example. So it is a very difficult situation, and it's a difficult journey.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. We're going to take one more question from Ian Callum. Would you like to state your question for Dr. Thiessen?
We could also read it, Charlotte, if Ian's not able to.
I will do that. How do human rights apparatuses, activities, and instruments overcome the legal but morally ambiguous usage of derogation of laws that are entrenched in human rights laws?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so yeah, so again, like it's yeah, one thing, or yeah, what I tried to do in my research was to situate the interviews at multiple levels, everything from global headquarters and to the national capital, Bishkek in this case. Then I also did interviews in a regional center, the city of Osh in the south, and then also tried to get a hold of some project officers that were working at the sort of very local level. And yeah, one of the things that I think peace and conflict studies, you know, and also certain parts of anthropology have been successful in uncovering is the way that you know, human rights conceptions and norms sort of, you know, travel down through these different levels and are, you know, maybe deleted or altered or ignored or you know, changed in some way as they sort of travel down through these levels and sort of land on the ground in a Kyrgyz village in the mountain somewhere. And so, you know, that sort of hierarchy of you know, change, I think, is very prone to you know, human, like particular aspects to human rights laws, you know, just simply being ignored, and you know, because in some cases there's even very little consequences if they are ignored, just because, you know, because of the sort of distance between the global headquarters and that local community. You know, accountability structures or reporting mechanisms may not actually function in enough detail or with enough honesty to really, you know, relay to the top that some of these human rights principles are being violated. And I think that's a you know, and so I think, you know, underneath the acceptance of ambiguity in the way projects are designed is the realization that this is actually happening, and so sometimes it's just easier to be ambiguous and then let the chips fall where they fall, at the, you know, at the ground level, if you know what I mean.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your great talk. I'm just going to close with a comment from Natasha Ali, because I think it's a great summary. I really appreciate Dr. Thiessen's points made in the lecture today, especially around the definition of extremism and what can incite terrorism. So, for example, white supremacy and Islamophobia can be considered violent extremism. For example, the Quebec mosque shootings in New Zealand. And the Indian residential schools can also be considered extremism. So again, thank you very much for your insightful lecture today. And thank you to everyone for joining us and for your great questions and attention. I just want to mention as we close about a reminder for upcoming Moro events. We have 2 more online lectures this month. Next Friday, our brown bag lecture we will be hosting Dr. Kauser Ahmed, who will share research and offer his perspective on the Canadian Freedom Convoy, what it is and what it isn't. And 2 Fridays from now, we will be hosting the MLT Aikens St. Paul's College University Affiliation Lecture, featuring Dr. Heather Eaton of St. Paul University in Ottawa. So Dr. Eaton will be offering her lecture as part of the Symposium for the Common Good, a new initiative of the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies here in St. Paul's College. And Dr. Eaton's lecture is titled Spirituality and Wonder, a Way Forward in Hard Times. The Zoom registration and further descriptions of these can be found on the Moro Institute website, and we'll also be sending out emails. So hopefully you can join us. Thanks, everyone.